Hello and welcome again to the second episode of OIL 103, Africa in the Global Context, a course that is offered by the Department of Political Science and Public Administration of the Open University of Tanzania. OIL 103 is about how Africa relates with the rest of the world, and it starts with the historical foundation of Africa way back during the slave trade, during colonial era, and to the post-colonial era. In the first part, we discussed about slave trade and colonialism and how the two impacted Africa's affairs, both economic and political, and even in the cultural side of it, because people now speak English, French, and Portuguese instead of using their traditional languages. The course is administered by me, myself, and I, Miraji Kitigwa, of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. Today, we are going to deal with post-colonial Africa. As previously we discussed about slave trade and colonialism in Africa. Now, it's high time we discuss post-colonial Africa. The predominant explanation on the deep roots of contemporary Africa development are centered around the influence of Europeans during the colonial period and even way back to the slavery and slave trade. Now, the prominent post-colonial African offshoots were the independence and the new forms of colonialism, the post-independence African foreign policies and the policies of non-aligned movement, and third, the African continent and the new international economic order. These three are the prominent post-colonial African offshoots that resulted from the roots of colonialism and the influence of Europeans. Starting with the independence and the new forms of colonialism that is experienced in Africa, we find that at independence, the metropolitan powers, I mean the former colonialists, bequeathed their African ex-colonies a confused and dysfunctional governance system, as we saw in the first knowledge area, that they introduced new forms of governance and tried to disrupt the traditional African forms of government. So the colonialists bequeathed their African ex-colonies a confused and dysfunctional governance system and a kind of economy built on the idea of selling cheap raw materials in return for the expensive European finished goods, the industrial products. This is what Africa inherited immediately after independence. And in the actual sense, this system debilitated Africa's post-colonial phase. you find most of the African countries produce what they do not consume and consume what they do not produce. Most of the manufactured goods come from the metropolitan countries. Conversely, much of what is produced in the agricultural sector, in the mining sector, and others like, are considered as cheap raw material that have to be sold out to the former colonialists for the purpose of increasing their values and taking them back to Africa and getting sold at the higher prices. And that's why I say this system of independence of Africa has debilitated the continent's post-colonial era. The process of decolonization, I mean the handing over of power to the native Africans from the colonialists, was sincerely poorly planned and executed. All the three main colonizers we did discuss about in the first knowledge area, I mean Britain, France, and Portugal, accepted the need for decolonization, but they were somewhat reluctant and implemented it all too rapidly. They actually were unprepared for the same thing to happen on this planet Earth. Much the same is true of the other side. The African people were not ready for self-governance because the decolonization process was poorly planned and abruptly executed. Thus, what I can say actually, these former colonizers had done little, very little, to help prepare their colonial subjects for the experience of governing themselves as new nations of Africa. So they just handed over power to the natives, Africans, with poor plans, unprepared, and that's why I would say they accepted the need for decolonization of Africa somewhat reluctantly and implemented it very rapidly, and they did very little to help prepare their colonial subjects for the experience of governing themselves as new nations in this world. Perhaps we can say that the wind of change from government and colonialism to government and natives blew up too suddenly. In the most shocking cases, the colonialists simply quit. And one of the good examples would be Portugal. Portugal just left its colonies in the 1970s. It left them like that, just after years of chronic armed rebellion in Angola, after prolonged armed rebellion in Mozambique, and even in Guinea-Bissau. Much the same is true of France, which withdrew from Guinea after the Guineans' rejection of their being part of the French territory after independence. Remember, France still has its own territories in Africa, including Reunion and some part of the Comoros Islands, the Mayotte Islands. So Guinea rejected the offer, and France had to quit just like that without making any preparation for the handover of power to the natives. In the real sense, the colonialists had in many cases imprisoned the political leaders who were to assume power after independence, rather than schooling them in the art of government. The freedom fighters and those who were just questing for freedom of their countries ended in prison instead of being taught how they could govern themselves, how they could govern their people. That was a very negative side of it. Let's make some reference of the famous leaders of the independence movement. One of such independence movement leaders was Menelik II. Menelik II was the king of Ethiopia, and he started pressing for independence in the late 1980s. And he managed to win independence from Italy. So Ethiopia is considered to be the first in Africa to be independent, though others would consider it as a country that was not colonized by the Europeans, but it was once colonized by Italy. Second in the chain of famous leaders of the independence movement in Africa is Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. Remember, Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana gained independence from England in 1957, and some consider Ghana as the first African country to gain true independence from the colonialists. And apart from pressing for independence, Kwame Nkrumah also pushed for Pan-Africanism, a movement for all Africans to work together. The third in the chain of famous leaders of African independence movement is Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta led the independence movement in Kenya from England, and his name Jomo Kenyatta means burning spear. Another famous leader of the African independence movement is none other than Julius Kambarage Nyerere, the Mwalimu, who led the independence movement from Britain for his country of Tanzania, and for some other Southern African countries like Angola, Zimbabwe, and even Mozambique. And he allowed his country to host the freedom fighters from other African countries, particularly those from Southern African part. And Dar es Salaam was the headquarters of the frontline states for the fight for freedom of Southern African countries. So Nyerere played a great role in the independence movement, not only of his country, but of other African countries. It is also said that the country, Tanzania, under his administration, hosted other freedom fighters from Sudan, for example, John Garang, who studied at the University of Dar es Salaam. Another famous leader of the African independence movement is Leopold Sédar Senghor. This was Senegal's famous poet and politician who led the Senegalese independence movement and inspired many African independence movements with his poems of freedom and African pride. It is argued that Senegal attained its freedom from France as a result of his work. Patrice Lumumba, who was later assassinated by US CIA plotting, is considered to be one of the freedom fighters of Congo. You know, Congo was colonized by Belgium. But remember, Belgium suddenly gave the Congo its independence in 1963. But with pressure from Patrice Lumumba. And this resulted in a long tribal civil war that was broken up by the United Nations troops. Joseph Mobutu, popularly known as Mobutu Sese Seko, who was an army general, took over and restored order and set up the first national government after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba by the Westerners. Remember, Patrice Lumumba was supportive of the communist wing, and the Western powers used the containment policy to curb any communist movement to grow up in the world. Thus, Patrice Lumumba was one of the culprits of the Western war against communism. In the independence and new forms of colonialism, we find that even after the departure, the European powers continued to do all they could in order to maintain their level of influence and to determine the terms of trade they had so long enjoyed. So they continued to be in command of international trade in Africa, and they were the ones who determined the price of both raw materials and manufactured goods. Thus, the European powers left the African continent in physical terms, but in the actual sense, they continued to do all they could do in order to maintain their level of influence and the term of trade they had so long enjoyed. And you find to date that a high level of dependence persisted even after independence for years afterwards, and to some extent continues today. Why does it continue today? It is because the European powers left the African continent reluctantly. They would rather wish to continue dominating the region. And how were the policies, the foreign policies of Africa after independence? The relations between the newly independent African states and the most powerful countries of the world from independence until 1989 were largely determined by what was called the Cold War. And this Cold War gave rise to the fourth wave of destructive influence in Africa. We will discuss about this Cold War later, but in real sense, the post-independence African foreign policy was determined by the East-West tension immediately after independence, and hence the formation of the non-aligned movement. What is this stuff called non-aligned movement? The non-aligned movement, abbreviated as NAM, was created and founded during the collapse of the colonial system and the independence struggles of the people of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and other regions of the world, and at the height of the Cold War. The objectives of the non-aligned movement were to support for self-determination. It was aimed at national independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity of the new states. It was also intended towards opposing to apartheid in both Israel against Palestine and in South Africa, where apartheid policy was on its high. The other objective of the non-aligned movement was for non-adherence to the multilateral military pacts. Remember, during those days, there were the two military pacts, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which consisted of the United States and the other Western allies of Western Europe. And on the other hand, there was the Warsaw Pact made up of Yugoslavia and led by the Soviet Union by then. The other objective of the formation of the non-aligned movement was the independence of non-aligned countries from great power or bloc influence and rivalry. But there are other scholars who object to the existence of the non-aligned movement. They would say that there was no, and there has never been, and there will not be such stuff as non-aligned movement. That the country that does not ally with any other, any bloc. They would say it is impossible. By the end of the 1980s, the non-aligned movement was facing the great challenge brought about by the collapse of the socialist bloc, and in particular following the disintegration of the former Soviet Union into 15 states. Hence, the Soviet Union became weak and it could not support any of its allies. What is the current status of the non-aligned movement? It is said that currently all African countries, except 2, are members of non-aligned movement. And those 2 countries are the Western Sahara, the Sahara Arab Democratic Republic, and South Sudan. Those are the only 2 African countries which are non-members of the non-aligned movement. The third segment in this episode is on Africa and the new international economic order. Regard must be had to the fact that during the 1970s and 1980s, the movement of the non-aligned countries played a great role in the struggle for the establishment of the new international economic order that would allow all the people of the world to make use of their wealth and natural resources and provide a wide platform for a fundamental change in international economic relations and economic emancipation of the countries of the South. The new international economic order was a set of proposals that was put forward during the 1970s by some developing countries through the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, to promote their interests and by improving their terms of trade, increasing development assistance, developed country tariff reduction, and other means. So the goal was trying to uplift the countries of the South, the poor countries. And so, in actual sense, the new international economic order was demanded by the non-aligned movement, of which African countries were members. What are the factors that influenced this demand? One was the big North-South gap. You know, by then, the Western countries, mostly in Europe and Latin America, were far well off compared to those in the South, and the gap was too wide to the degree that the countries of the South had to demand for some kind of trying to balance the consumption of world resources. And this leads us to the second factor, which is the excessive exploitation of world economy and the income and the resources by the developed world. Much of the income and resources of the world were consumed by the developed world. So the countries of the South, the poor countries, had to come up and try to demand for the reformation of the international economic order. The other factor was the failure of the Bretton Woods institutions. These are the World Bank and the International Bank for International International Monetary Fund, which were established for the purpose of reconstruction of the war-torn Europe. And so the third world countries from the north did not benefit from those institutions, so they considered them as failure, and hence they demanded for the new international economic order. The last factor is the new colonial role of the North over the South. In the view of the South, the countries of the North were truly in command of the affairs of the South. So it was kind of a second liberation movement. The objectives of the new international economic order were to promote economic development among the poor countries through self-help and South-South cooperation, of which, again, African states were staunch members. And the South-South cooperation was mainly headed by the countries of Asia, in Indonesia in particular. The new international economic order intended to deal with the major problems of the South, such as balance of payment disequilibrium, debt crisis, exchange scarcity, and many other aspects that were at the South's disadvantage. And so the new international economic order was like a struggle against the repression of the developed countries. Having said this, we could find how Africa was immediately after independence. We saw the post-colonial African posture. We saw the African post-colonial foreign policy relations, in which the non-aligned movement is part, and we have finally seen Africa and its part in the formation and implementation of the new international economic order. Having said this, I would say thank you, and this is the end of the second episode.